In 1931, inside a small butcher shop in Ohio, 1 pound of ground beef was wrapped in butcher paper and sold for about 9 cents. That package of meat fit neatly in the hand of a working mother, soft, fatty, and cheap enough to take home when the money in her purse had already grown thin. On the kitchen table, there was a half-cut onion, a few slices of stale bread, a can of tomatoes, and a black cast-iron skillet still holding the smell of grease from the night before. The window pane was fogged with steam. Inside the recipe box, a card written in pencil read, "Ground beef dinner, 1933, 15 cents." That kitchen was poor, but it was never careless. There was little meat, but the flavor was still held on to. She knew how to soak bread in milk, sprinkle flour into the meat drippings, save every drop of grease in the pan, and turn a pot of beans into something that smelled like a real supper. On this list, there is a 15-cent pot of soup, a skillet of noodles that only needs a lid, a 2-cent head of cabbage, brown gravy sinking into mashed potatoes, and the #1 dish, a meatloaf that held together a whole hard week. Tonight, that old recipe box is being opened one more time. Pull a chair close to the stove. If the memory of this old kitchen reminds you of someone, subscribe to the channel. 25 recipes begin with number 25. Soup pots that stretched across several days. Before there were baking pans, meat loaves, or meat patties set in the middle of the table, many Depression-era kitchens began with a pot of hot water. A little ground beef, browned well in a pan, was enough to make the house smell like dinner. Grease clung to the bottom of the pot. Steam fogged the window glass. The sound of a wooden spoon scraping softly against cast iron felt like a very small sign that tonight there was still something to share. Number 25. Ground beef soup steam rose from the cast iron pot at the back of the wood stove, carrying the mild smell of beef, soft potatoes, sweet carrots, and onions slowly melting into the broth. In 1932, in unemployed households around the industrial belt of Detroit and Toledo, a pot of ground beef soup, costing about 15 cents, could feed the whole table. Just a 1/4 pound of meat, a few potatoes, some carrots, 1 onion, and water were enough to make dinner. She browned the meat first, saving every little streak of grease. The potatoes were chopped small so they would soften quickly, the leftover carrots were sliced thin, and minced onion was dropped into the pot with a light crackle. She poured in enough water to cover everything, stirred up the brown bits stuck to the bottom, then let it simmer over low heat. If there was still flour, she sprinkled in a spoonful to make the soup thicker. In homes where work had been lost, soup lasted more than one meal. Tonight, it was thick. Tomorrow at noon, it will be thinner. By the third day, the remaining broth still carried the smell of meat. On the yellowed recipe card, the year 1932 sat beside an old grease stain like a quiet reminder. If the smell of potatoes and onions makes you remember an old kitchen, stay a little longer. 1 small pot, 3 warm days. Number 14. Ground beef noodle soup. Dried egg noodles fell into the pot as lightly as paper, then softened and swelled, pulling the beef broth into something between soup and stew. In 1933, during the cold season in working-class apartment buildings from Harlem, New York, to the south side of Chicago, about 11 cents could become a pot of ground beef noodle soup for 4 people. The cold out on the stairwell made the steam in the kitchen feel even more precious. She browned the ground beef right in the pot, letting the fat render slowly. Onion and carrots went into that fat and were stirred until they gave off a gentle smell. Water was poured in. The egg noodles were dropped straight into the pot, and everything cooked until each strand had taken in the broth, the beef fat, and the sweetness of the vegetables. In cramped apartment buildings, the smell of soup often climbed the stairs before anyone saw the bowl. Work coats hung near the door. Shoes still carried dust from the street. Down in the kitchen, the soup simmered softly, like steady breathing. Listen to the sound of noodles touching the side of the pot, because inside that sound is an old winter. The smell of soup arrived before dinner. Number 4, ground beef and cabbage soup. The pot of soup began on Monday morning and was still warm by Thursday night, when the cabbage had almost melted into the broth. In 1935, in the industrial towns of the Northeast and Appalachia, especially around Pittsburgh, Scranton, and Wheeling, a pot of ground beef soup with cabbage costing about 12 cents could keep the stove going through many meals. A little meat, 1 head of cabbage, tomatoes, 1 onion, and water formed the heart of it. She browned the meat thoroughly first, letting the smell of beef sink deep into the bottom of the pot. Onion was added, roughly cut cabbage fell in as pale chunks, and thin red tomatoes blended into the water. The pot simmered for hours over a low flame, bubbling steadily until the cabbage softened, turned deeply sweet, and nearly became part of the broth. For working families, a long-simmered pot made the next night's dinner feel less heavy. Whoever came home late still had a hot bowl. Whoever woke early still had broth left to warm again. That was how a poor house held on to warmth. If you have ever seen a window fogged with steam on a cold evening, keep that image. Cabbage melting, the house is warm. Those pots of soup showed how a little meat could perfume a lot of water. But when the kitchen needed something that would keep people full longer, she took down beans, rice, and the things that could hold a stomach through the whole day. Beans, rice, and the things that made meat go further. After the thin pots of soup that stretched across several days, the poor kitchen moved into a different kind of calculation. Dried beans, white rice, and canned tomatoes began to speak for themselves. In that kitchen, a little ground beef and a pot of beans created the flavor of a real dinner, then left the rest for cheaper things to carry on. Number 22. Ground beef and bean stew. The smell of long-simmered pinto beans clung to the kitchen, thick and warm, while at the bottom of the pot, a little ground beef slowly melted into each bean. In 1933, in relief households across the Oklahoma and Texas Dust Bowl, a pot of ground beef and bean stew, costing about 8 cents, could begin with 1 pound of pinto beans priced at 5 cents, plus a 1/4 pound of ground beef and 1 small onion. She soaked the beans early, when the kitchen was still cold and the light out in the yard was still gray. By afternoon, she browned the meat with onion, poured the swollen beans into the pot, added water, and let it simmer over low heat for hours. The pot bubbled softly. The bean broth thickened. The meat fat melted slowly, clinging to the bean skins, making the whole pot smell more filling than the money that had gone into it. In lean times, dried beans were like the kitchen's insurance. They sat in a tin for months, waiting until the cash was nearly gone, then quietly became dinner. If your family's old kitchen once had a tin of beans like that, hold on to that memory. Dried beans kept the stove from going out. Number 21, ground beef and rice. A can of white rice sat open on the table, the dry grains making a soft rushing sound as they hit the bottom of the pot. Then each grain began to carry the smell of beef fat and onion. In 1933, in African-American kitchens across the South, especially around working-class Louisiana and Mississippi, a pot of ground beef and rice costing about 8 cents could rely on cheap rice, onion, water, and a very small portion of meat. She browned the beef with the onion until the bottom of the pot turned lightly brown. The rice was stirred into the hot fat and tossed until every grain had a shine before the water was poured in. The lid was set tight. The flame was turned low. Inside, the rice absorbed the taste of meat, the taste of onion, and the thin, salty liquid left behind after a long day. In a poor kitchen, every drop of meat juice had somewhere to go. White rice held on to the flavor that a separate plate of meat would have lost. It made a small handful of beef spread more evenly, more softly, more quietly. Listen to the lid trembling gently on the stove. Every grain of rice held the scent. Number 20. Depression-era chili bean stew chili powder met hot tomatoes, and the warm, spicy smell rose first, then red beans pulled the whole pot of stew into something dark and thick. In 1934, in the Texas Panhandle and in migrant labor camps from Oklahoma to California, a pot of chili bean stew costing about 19 cents could be made with ground beef, red beans, canned tomatoes, onion, and a pinch of chili powder. She browned the meat first, letting the smell of beef touch the bottom of the pot. Onion was added to soften. Canned tomatoes were poured in with their pale red juice. Then the soaked beans and chili powder followed. The pot simmered until it grew thick, deep red, hot enough to warm the hands holding the bowl, and filling enough for 2 meals in a row. In migrant labor camps, beans were the way to make a pot of meat feed many people. 1 spoonful was shared among each bowl. A little meat traveled through beans, through tomatoes, through the dusty heat of late afternoon. If this story reminds you of a meal that once had to be divided very carefully, stay with it. Debate was a luxury. Beans and rice helped meat go further, but in workers' kitchens, schools, and factories, there was another way. Put everything into one pot, cover it, and let dinner thicken on its own. Macaroni, casseroles, and one-pot suppers. When the workday ran long, a single pot could carry the whole kitchen. Meat, macaroni, tomatoes, and corn met in the heat, thickened slowly, then turned into a dinner filling enough for many people. Number 19. American-style beef macaroni stew. The smell of hot tomatoes, softened onion, and beef fat filled the school kitchen, while elbow macaroni slowly took on the orange-red color of the stew. In 1935, in school cafeterias and workers' kitchens across Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan, a pot of American-style beef macaroni stew costing about 30 cents could feed many small bowls with ground beef, elbow macaroni, tomatoes or tomato juice, and onion. She browned the meat with onion until the bottom of the pot darkened. Tomatoes were added, red and lightly tart. The dry macaroni was poured straight in, then the lid was closed. Inside, the macaroni absorbed the tomato juice, beef fat, and onion smell, each little curve softening in the plain, everyday sauce that children would remember for a long time. Cafeterias used this dish because it was cheap, filling, and easy to divide. 1 ladleful on an aluminum tray could make a child believe that lunch that day truly had meat in it. If the sound of a ladle touching a tray reminds you of an old school, hold on to that image. Wednesday smelled like macaroni stew. Number 18. 1 pot elbow, macaroni and beef. The pot lid trembled gently as the macaroni drank up the water, and inside, the beef fat made each little curve shine under the heat. In 1933, in the lunch pails of workers in Detroit, Flint, and the factory kitchens of the Great Lakes region, a pan of elbow macaroni with beef costing about 13 cents could go with a laborer through a long shift. She browned 1 pound of ground beef with onion, keeping the fat in the pan. The dry macaroni went in right after, rattling under the wooden spoon. Just enough water was added to cover it, the lid was set tight, and the heat was lowered. The macaroni swelled slowly, cooking until it had absorbed all the liquid and held on to the meat flavor left at the bottom of the pan. Factory workers needed something solid, easy to carry, and able to sit for a few hours in a tin lunch pail. When the lid was opened in the middle of a shift, the smell of onion and beef was still there. 1 pan, 1 lid, enough to eat. Number 17. Hoover stew. 1 can of corn, 1 can of tomatoes, and a little macaroni sat on the church kitchen table. The name had a bitter taste, but the pot was still warm. In 1932, in Chicago charity kitchens, Detroit church basements, and urban relief lines, a large pot of Hoover stew costing about 25 cents could be made from ground beef, macaroni, canned corn, and canned tomatoes. She browned the meat first, then added cooked macaroni. Canned corn was poured in with its faint sweet liquid, and canned tomatoes followed, turning the pot a soft red. Everything simmered until the macaroni swelled, the corn mellowed, the tomatoes turned lightly tart, and the meat spread evenly through every ladleful. This dish belonged to lines of people, long benches, church basements, and community kitchens that had to count every portion carefully enough to make it last. The cook looked at the pot, looked at the bowls, then divided by an eye made practiced from use. If this story reminds you of a meal that once had to be shared with great care, stay with it. The name was bitter, but the pot was still warm. Number 16, cornbread topped, beef tray bake. The smell of sweet corn and hot beef rose as the tray came out of the oven, the top golden, the bottom soft from soaking up the meat juices. In 1934, at county fairs and southern potluck suppers from Oklahoma to Texas, a tray of cornbread-topped beef, costing about 22 cents, could make a small amount of meat look like the main dish. She browned the beef with onion, then added creamed corn and a pinch of chili powder. The hot filling was poured into an old enamel tray and spread flat with the back of a spoon. A thin layer of cornbread batter covered the top. Then the tray went into the oven until the surface turned golden, the edges grew slightly crisp, and the underside soaked up the meat juices. A tray like that was easy to carry to church, a county fair, or a potluck supper. When placed in the middle of the table, it felt fuller than the meat inside it really was. Cornbread covered what was missing. One pot could feed many people, but when the kitchen needed to set something in the center of the table, she used old bread, oats, and both hands to shape the small portion of meat. Bread, oats, and the shapes that salved supper. Some dinners needed more than a bowl. They needed a shape, a meatloaf, a patty. Something was set in the middle of the table under the low light so the whole family could see that the meal was still being cared for. Number 15, oatmeal meatloaf. The dark red ketchup glaze on top of the meatloaf began to turn sweet in the oven, while the smell of meat, onion, and hot oats spread through the small kitchen. In 1934, in church cookbooks from Ohio to Oklahoma, an oatmeal meatloaf costing about 16 cents could begin with 1 pound of ground beef priced at nearly 9 cents, plus oats, an egg, onion, and a little milk. She mixed the meat with oats in a deep enamel bowl, added the egg, grated onion, and milk, then pressed the mixture into a pan. The top of the loaf was brushed with a thin layer of ketchup, red and shiny under the oven light. As it baked slowly, the oats swelled, holding in the meat juices, holding in the onion smell, holding even the soft, moist center inside every slice. 1 pound of meat was hard to divide among 6 people if it sat alone on a plate. But in a meatloaf pan, it looked fuller. The knife came down. Each slice was laid out. If that image reminds you of a poor but warm Sunday table, stay a little longer. Oats kept the meat from leaving. Number 14, bread-stretched meat patties. 2 slices of stale bread sat in a bowl of milk, softening, turning mushy, then changing 4 small patties into a whole plate that could be shared. In 1932, in rented homes across the Midwest and the South, a meal of bread-stretched meat patties costing about 15 cents could use 1 pound of ground beef, stale bread, milk, an egg, and a little black pepper. She soaked the bread in milk until the crumbs softened under her fingertips. The bread was squeezed apart, mixed into the raw meat with egg, salt, and pepper. Then she shaped each patty in the palm of her hand, pressed it gently flat, and fried it in hot grease. The edges browned first. The middle stayed soft, carrying the smell of milk and meat. The children around the table might not have noticed the bread inside the patty. They remembered the sound of the skillet singing, the browned edges of the meat, the chipped enamel plate being passed from hand to hand. Stale bread knew how to hold on to meat. Number 13, mock roast Sunday still needed to feel like Sunday. On the table, a loaf of ground beef was sliced like a real roast. In 1933, at Sunday dinners in unemployed families in Cleveland and Detroit, a mock roast costing about 11 cents for one loaf could be made from 1 pound of ground beef priced at nearly 9 cents, onion, salt, and pepper. She pressed the ground beef firmly into a loaf shape, rubbed onion, salt, and pepper over the outside, then set it on a roasting rack. The heat of the oven made the outside turn dark, slightly crisp and blistered, with the look of a roast from better years. When the knife cut down, the slices came apart, slowly, soft and hot, carrying the smell of roasted onion. When the man of the house had lost his job, Sunday dinner still needed something to stand at the center of the table. The air grew quieter. Chairs scraped softly across the floor. A coat hung over the back of a chair. A false roast could hold on to a little dignity for the whole room. Sunday still needed to be Sunday. Bread and oats helped meat keep its shape. But in the old kitchen, vegetables could also work like a bowl, a covering, and a second helping of meat. Vegetables that became the bowel, the wrap, and the second portion of meat. In the stack of cards inside the recipe box, the dishes with ground beef were often written on lined paper beside old grease stains and a few small numbers in the corner. 1934, 12 cents, 1 pound of meat. She did not need pretty handwriting. She needed that dish to still work. There were days when the meat was too little to stand in the middle of the table. When that happened, vegetables carried the rest of the work. Cabbage held the meat. Bell peppers became bowls. Onions kept their sweetness, wrapped around the poor filling. Number 12. Ground beef and cabbage skillet. Thin sliced cabbage fell into the skillet with a dry rustle, then slowly softened under the lid, soaking up hot beef fat and the smell of golden onion. In 1936, in Eastern European immigrant neighborhoods in Pittsburgh and Cleveland, a skillet of ground beef and cabbage costing about 11 to 12 cents could begin with 1 pound of ground beef priced at nearly 9 cents, 1 head of cabbage for 2 cents, an onion, and salt. She browned the beef first, letting the bottom of the skillet darken and grow fragrant. Onion was added to soften, and the cabbage was sliced into thin strips before being poured into the pan. The lid went on. The heat stayed trapped inside, making the vegetable wilt down, taking in every drop of meat fat, every trace of salt, every brown smell clinging to the cast iron. In steel towns, cabbage was cheap, sturdy, and easy to divide. 1 hot skillet could be eaten tonight, then warmed the next day after the factory whistle again. If the soft rattle of a skillet lid reminds you of an old kitchen, hold on to that sound. Cabbage made the meat go further. Number 11. Stuffed cabbage rolls. She blanched each cabbage leaf, placed the filling in the center, then rolled it slowly, like folding a small blanket around dinner. In 1934, in Polish families in Chicago, Slovak families in Cleveland, and Hungarian families in Detroit, 12 stuffed cabbage rolls costing about 19 cents could feed the whole table with ground beef, rice, onion, and thinned tomato sauce. She blanched the cabbage leaves until they softened, then spread each one out on the table. The ground beef was mixed with rice, onion, and salt. A spoonful of filling was placed in the middle. The edges of the leaf were folded in, rolled tight, and packed close together in a heavy pot. Thin tomato sauce was poured over the top, seeping into every fold of leaf as the pot began to simmer softly. Each immigrant community had its own name for those rolls, but in years of shortage, they all understood the same thing. The more rice you added, the more people the meat could feed. Each leaf held a meal. Number 10. Poorhouse stuffed peppers. The green peppers softened in a shallow tray, while inside, the meat and rice filling bubbled under a layer of stewed tomatoes. In 1934, on Georgia farms and at rural Southern church gatherings, a tray of stuffed peppers costing about 13 cents could use half a pound of ground beef, rice, summer bell peppers, and stewed tomatoes. She hollowed out each pepper, keeping the skins whole like little green bowls. The meat was browned with rice and tomatoes, salted by feel, then packed tightly into each pepper. The tray went into the oven. The heat softened the peppers, the filling swelled, and the tomato juices bubbled gently around the bottom of the tray. At a country church, each family could bring one tray. The peppers stood side by side on the long table, holding the hot filling until a spoon touched them. No one left with an empty stomach. The pepper became the bowl. Number 9. Onions stuffed with ground beef. The baked onions turned translucent, grew sweeter, and gave off a caramel smell that filled the whole house with a warm sharpness at the bridge of the nose. In 1934, in the Oklahoma Panhandle and western Kansas, when bell peppers were out of season, a tray of stuffed onions costing about 10 cents could be made with half a pound of ground beef, onions at 2 cents a pound, cooked rice, and salt. She cut the onions in half, hollowed them out, then minced the scooped-out centers very finely. The chopped onion was mixed back into the ground beef and rice, making a soft, fragrant filling with a faint sweetness. Each onion shell was filled, set in a tray with a little water, then baked until the onion edges turned clear and the filling darkened. Onions were sturdy, cheap, and easy to store. When summer vegetables had left the market, they still sat in the corner of the kitchen, waiting to be turned into dinner. Outside the door, prairie dust covered the porch. Inside, the tray of onions still gave off warmth. When the peppers were gone, the onions spoke up. Vegetables helped give the meat a place to stay. But on some nights, what held the whole table together was not the shape of the dish. It was the hot sauce running down over bread, potatoes, and soft, risen dough, gravy, potatoes, biscuits, and the meals that made the table go quiet. Some meals had their own kind of beauty. They were hot, thick, soft, and made the spoon move more slowly. When beef gravy ran down over soft biscuits, or pan-fried potatoes crackled crisp against the bottom of cast iron, the whole table often went quiet first. Number 8. Ground beef gravy over soft biscuits. There were evenings when the whole table fell silent. The pale milk gravy covered the hot biscuits, thick and smooth, carrying the smell of beef fat and black pepper. In 1933, in working family kitchens from Georgia to Montana, especially across the South and the Midwest, a meal of ground beef gravy over soft biscuits costing about 12 cents could warm the whole table after a long day. She browned half a pound of ground beef in a cast iron skillet, keeping the glossy fat at the bottom. Flour was sprinkled in and stirred until it turned lightly colored and lost its raw smell. Then milk was poured in slowly, thin white streams meeting the hot fat and thickening. She stirred slowly, poured in a little more, added salt, and let the gravy fall over soft biscuits that had just been split open. Workers came home with heavy shoulders, their hands still carrying the smell of iron, soil, and warehouses. They needed something hot, fatty, soft, and heavy enough to hold the body through the night. On the table, every drop of gravy in the skillet mattered. If the sound of a spoon touching a soft biscuit reminds you of an old evening, stay with it. No one talked when the gravy was hot. Number 7. Ground beef and pan-fried potatoes. Monday morning began with the sound of potatoes hitting the cast iron skillet, dry and firm, while the bottom slowly turned deep brown, crisp, and salty. In 1932, in the homes of steelworkers in Pittsburgh and Youngstown, a skillet of ground beef with pan-fried potatoes costing about 8 cents could be gathered from scraps of beef, leftover potatoes, onion, salt, and pepper. She cut the potatoes from Sunday's meal into small pieces and left them near the stove so their surfaces could dry. Beef scraps and onion went into the skillet first and were stirred until fragrant. The potatoes followed, then she pressed everything down against the hot cast iron with the back of a spoon. The skillet sat still, it needed waiting. The bottom crisped before being turned up in fragrant brown pieces. This was the dish of the morning after Sunday, when leftovers began a new life in the old skillet. A lunch pail sat open on the chair. A worker's coat hung near the door, The smell of brown potatoes pulled people out of sleepiness. The sound of potatoes opened the workday. Number 6. Beef pot pie, topped with soft biscuits. The meat filling bubbled through the spaces between the golden risen biscuits, while the smell of hot dough and leftover vegetables softened the kitchen. In 1934, in small towns across the Ohio River Valley and Appalachia, a tray of beef pot pie topped with soft biscuits, costing about 15 cents, could move from a poor kitchen to the middle of the table as a main dish. She browned the ground beef with whatever vegetables were left, maybe carrots, peas, onion, or small-cut potatoes. Flour was sprinkled in to thicken the meat juices. The hot filling was poured into a tray. Then spoonfuls of soft biscuit dough were dropped over the top. As it baked, the biscuits puffed up, turning golden on the peaks, while underneath they soaked in the steam from the simmering meat. When enough ingredients for a full pie crust became a luxury, soft biscuit dough became the warm lid for the whole tray of filling. The small bubbling sound at the edge of the tray sounded like dinner holding itself together. If you have ever seen a hot tray set down on the table and everyone goes quiet for a few seconds, you understand this dish. Soft biscuits covered what was missing. Gravy and biscuits held on to the warmth of the meal. But there was another way to make a little meat look like more. Roll it into balls, shape it into patties, coat it with flour, and let the sauce do the rest. Meatballs, patties, and the waz, a little meat looked like more. When meat was rolled into balls, shaped into patties, or simmered in red sauce, it began to look like more than itself. It was not a trick meant to fool the eye. It was a way to divide food fairly at a crowded table, where every small portion needed to be seen. Number 5. Ground beef meatballs, cooked in broth. The small meatballs rested on an enamel plate, soft and speckled with grated onion. When they dropped into the gently simmering pot, they rose very slowly. In 1933, in German immigrant families in Minnesota and Missouri, a pot of ground beef meatballs cooked in broth, costing about 12 cents, could be made with ground beef, grated onion, flour, broth, or salted water. She mixed the meat with grated onion, salt, pepper, and flour in a deep bowl. Her hands rolled each small ball, each one just the right size for a spoon. The pot of water on the stove simmered softly, the surface trembling in thin rings. She dropped them in one by one, kept the heat low, and waited until the meat floated up and the broth turned a warm, cloudy color. Children often looked for the meatballs first. Parents looked at the liquid left in the pot and understood how flour, onion, and fat had made dinner thicker. If that image reminds you of an old bowl of soup, stay a little longer. The meatballs rose and dinner arrived. Number 4. Meatball and vegetable stew. The smell of browned meatballs met potatoes and carrots in the same pot, while the flour coating thickened the stew. In 1934, in Italian communities in New York and New Jersey, Polish neighborhoods and Midwestern farms, a pot of meatball and vegetable stew costing about 18 cents could feed the whole table with small meatballs and chopped vegetables. She rolled the meat into small balls, coated them in flour, and then browned them in the pan until the outside was set. Potatoes, carrots, and onions were browned in that same fat before water was added. The stew slowly cooked down. The flour dissolved, the vegetables softened, and the meatballs sat in the middle of the stew like separate portions, so everyone could have a piece. Each community had a different name for it, but the calculation in a poor kitchen was almost the same. The meat was divided into small pieces, vegetables came along with it, and the sauce stretched the rest. The poor pot looked richer. Number 3. Ground beef patties, simmered in tomato sauce. The red tomato sauce thickened around the browned patties. The onions softened, and a little sugar made the sourness gentler. In 1935, at church suppers across the Great Plains, from Nebraska to Kansas, and on Alabama recipe cards, a skillet of ground beef patties simmered in tomato sauce, costing about 21 cents, could sit in the middle of the table as the main dish. She shaped the meat into thin patties and browned both sides in the skillet. Canned tomatoes were poured in, bringing onion and a little sugar with them. The heat was lowered. The skillet simmered until the sauce clung to each patty, deep red, fragrant with onion, and just sweet enough for stale bread to wipe the bottom of the plate clean. Women from Alabama to Nebraska could cook this dish almost the same way, even if they had never met. Shortage often led many kitchens to the same answer. If that layer of red sauce reminds you of a quiet table, hold on to that feeling. Red sauce kept the whole table there. Meatballs and red sauce made the small amount of meat look like more. But the closer the list came to its end, the quieter the food became, softer, gentler, and closer to the memories inside kitchens where people spoke softly. The last two recipes from the hushed kitchen. The closer the list came to its end, the quieter the kitchen became. The large pots had moved into the background. The crowded church trays had moved back, K2. On the table, there were still mashed potatoes, a layer of brown gravy, a meatloaf pan, and the smell of a warm oven, and saying that the week was still all right. Number 2. Ground beef gravy. Over mashed potatoes sat on the plate, soft and white. When the light brown beef gravy was poured over them, the whole table went quiet for a while. In 1933, in the coal fields of West Virginia and the workers' kitchens of Pittsburgh, a meal of ground beef gravy over mashed potatoes, costing about 18 cents, could include ground beef, russet potatoes, milk, flour, salt, and pepper. She browned the meat until it turned deep brown, keeping all the fat in the skillet. Flour was sprinkled in and stirred until it disappeared into the hot fat. Milk was poured in slowly, thin streams thickening into gravy, fragrant with the smell of caramelized beef. The smooth mashed potatoes were already waiting on the plate for the gravy to cover them. For working families, potatoes formed the base of the meal, but the gravy turned that white base into something that smelled of meat, warm milk, and real fullness. The spoon moving through the potatoes sounded slow and soft. If you have ever remembered a quiet dinner, hold on to that moment. Mashed potatoes held on to the gravy. Number 1. Depression-era meatloaf. The smell of meatloaf baking in the oven did not say the house had plenty. It said something smaller, that the week was still all right. In 1934, in working family kitchens across Ohio and Michigan, a Depression-era meatloaf could cost about $1, the most serious meat purchase of the week. But it gave back 3 meals from the same loaf pan. She mixed ground beef with stale bread that had been soaked in milk, then added egg, onion, salt, and pepper. Both hands pressed the mixture into the pan, spread a layer of ketchup over the top, and sent it into the oven to bake slowly. When it came out, the meatloaf needed to rest for a while before the nigh was cut down. Each slice came apart, hot, soft, and fragrant with onion and bread soaked in meat juices. The first night it was eaten hot. The second day it was tucked between slices of bread. On the morning of the third day, it was chopped into pan-fried potatoes. One meatloaf quietly rearranged the whole week. By the final dish, ground beef no longer felt like an ingredient. It felt like the way a difficult week was held together. 1 meatloaf, 3 meals, 25 recipes had passed by. From the 15-cent soup pot to the meatloaf that made 3 meals, the old recipe box was almost closed. 25 recipes had passed through the American working kitchen, from the 15-cent pot of soup to the meatloaf, from 1934. Enough to be divided into 3 meals. They moved through the kitchens of Pittsburgh steelworkers, Harlem apartments, the south side of Chicago, Georgia farms, the Oklahoma and Texas Dust Bowl, Detroit church basements, and then returned to small dining tables in Cleveland, Toledo, Michigan, and Ohio. Some dishes began with a pot of water, some began with 1 cup of rice, some began with stale bread, 2-cent cabbage, or 1 pound of ground beef set beside a quiet worry. In her hands, 1 pound of ground beef carried more than its own weight. It held fat in the skillet, stretched through a pot of beans, soaked into stale bread, rested inside a meatloaf, and placed on the table the feeling that the family was still being cared for. The final card was placed back into the wooden recipe box. One corner of the paper still held a grease stain. The pencil line marked 1934 had almost faded away. Smoke from the cast iron skillet rose very lightly, as if dinner still lingered in the house. If one dish on this list reminds you of your grandmother's kitchen, leave its name below. Maybe in an old drawer, there is still a recipe card waiting to be read again. Maybe she never wrote the whole recipe down because she already knew it by heart.